Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Q4 Technology and Practice webinar. Today we have Kevin Nardone, a Senior Enterprise Architect here at Citrix, and Jeff Mitchell, a Cloud Solution Architect at Microsoft. They're going to be giving you tips on Windows Virtual Desktop. After the presentation, we'll open it up for some live Q&A at the end, so feel free to go ahead and start typing in your questions at any point. And also keep in mind that the recording will be available on demand at the bottom of the registration page in about a week or so. So without further ado, let's get started.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. And this is Kevin Nardone. I'm a member of our Citrix consulting team. And to kind of kick things off, especially when we're discussing Citrix on Azure, there's a lot to Citrix on Azure, but today, we're really getting to discuss something very exciting. That's Windows Virtual Desktop. So thinking of, the overall agenda and goals for today's webinar, we're going to really kick off with, what is Microsoft WVD? What does it entail? What does it provide? And what can it do? What is it going to do for our Citrix and Microsoft customers? We're also going to cover integration. How do we use WVD within the Citrix workspace? How does Citrix enhance the capabilities of Microsoft WVD to really drive greater levels of business value within the Citrix and Microsoft ecosystem? And then planning. How, as a customer, what's the best way to drive the value out of WVD? What's the best way to plan for its deployment? And overall, at Citrix on Azure tips to help you be successful. But Jeff, would you want to walk us through Microsoft WVD?
Absolutely, Kevin. Thank you. So my name is Jeff Mitchell. I'm a Cloud Solution Architect with Microsoft who works with partners to build their solutions. And I'd like to really kick off with what is Windows Virtual Desktop. It's a desktop and app virtualization service that runs on the cloud. WVD is a virtual app solution that's efficient, productive, and secure in the cloud. And so this helps deliver desktops and applications to end users. It reduces costs by pooling resources together. Then the new Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session capability exclusive to Windows Virtual Desktop and the remote desktop session host, we can greatly reduce the number of virtualized machines and operating system overhead while still providing the same resources to users. So we have this multi-session Windows 10. We've also optimized our Office 365 performance for virtualization in the cloud. And the benefits of cloud in general, right? We get the benefit of scalability and agility to spin up resources and spin them down when we need them. So we look at additional benefits. The WVD service, Windows Virtual Desktop, provides a management layer where resources can be allocated. It also has this flexible delivery model where we can provide applications or desktops, right, to end users, whether it be their virtual desktop infrastructure sort of model or whether that's a shared hosted desktop model. And we get to provide a clear value stream with our customers who are currently using Windows 7 on-prem, where now if you have Windows 7, we have free extended updates, and we're going to talk about those extended update opportunities a little later on. So the idea around the Windows Virtual Desktop service is that we can provide users with access to the applications and desktops in the cloud where natively for an organization, a lot of their computing is already happening for their data center. And we can integrate that with the security and management services around identity for Azure Active Directory and our secure advanced threat protection services and all of the value that comes from Microsoft 365. So we have this security and management plus productivity with Office 365 and a clear, easy way to access resources. So another technology that we have is FS Logic that's built into the Windows Virtual Desktop service. So when we think about profile containers, the value here is that we can allow full access to OneDrive and the ability to run Outlook in cache mode. So this dramatically speeds up the logon time and application launch times of resources and apps that would be available to a user. So this new technology makes Office 365 much more performant in multi-user virtualized environments. And addresses the ability to be able to log on quickly, as well as the ability to manage from an administrator's point of view all of my users' files and for their profiles. So we're getting out of that user profile disk and out of that roaming profiles space and into using FXLogix for these profile containers. The next piece of this is app masking. And so with app masking, an administrator has the ability to make one application catalog image that's this golden image. And then that golden image, you can control through app masking what users have access to what applications in the environment. And the last is Java redirection. And this is really about matching up the correct or most secure version and up-to-date version of Java to the user sessions where they're accessing either Java applications on their desktop or even through the browser, so that we can make sure we're matching up the compatible versions of Java and most secure versions of Java as users access those resources. So let's talk about what this all means in the context of virtualization today. So in the past, when we talked about virtualization, we really had two scenarios that we thought about. The first scenario was we used Windows Server, and we had a large number of users who would access resources, so they had multiple sessions on this desktop. It wasn't exactly the same as Windows 10, and so we had another option for virtualization, which was just to have a single instance of Windows 10. And so that user got the full resources of that virtual machine, the full resources of that physical machine. That was for them specifically to be able to run their session, whereas on the server mode, we had multiple users, and it was shared resources across that space. And so what we've introduced with Windows Virtual Desktop is this new multi-session Windows 10. And multi-session Windows 10 allows us to get all the benefits of having a personalized desktop, but on a client operating system, which allows us to be compatible with application catalogs or applications that previously were only compatible with servers. Now we are compatible with them on the client, from a client point of view. The other benefit of having this multi-user scenario is that now we don't have to go just a one-to-one environment to access a virtual desktop for our end users. We can stack our end users on a single resource in the cloud, a virtual machine, and we can optimize our users' access and the density of those users in order to scale this. So we've got that same the same value from Windows Server where we had multiple users on this new multi-user version of Windows 10.
Exactly, and especially when we think of that net new capability, that net new use case of that multi-session Win10 and some of the benefits for just overall management of the solution, especially thinking of app packaging. Application teams will no longer need to manage packages for client OS versus server OS if they want to drive a multi-session, overall multi-session experience to have greater levels of scalability and reduce their infrastructure. So thinking about how we pull that into a Citrix perspective, we need to think about what's out there. What are some of the Citrix capabilities today when it comes to virtual apps and desktops? You have the traditional, do-it-yourself model with Citrix Virtual App and Desktop having that controller and virtual delivery agent architecture that our customers are familiar with today and have been doing virtualizations with for years. And then we also have the cloud services, especially starting in 2015 as Citrix has started to develop and introduce Citrix Cloud to our customer base. We have the Virtual App and Desktop service that takes that cloud platform mentality to being able to shift away from the monotony of systems management, focusing more on the workloads that exist in a customer's data center or Azure resource location, and then being able to manage that as with that overall platform-based service within Citrix Cloud. And then a new capability that's just been added in this year is the concept of Citrix Managed Desktops, where Citrix will actually host within a Citrix-owned Azure subscription the applications and desktop workloads that can be used. So think of a desktop as a service type offering, except across app workloads, desktop workloads, single session, multi-session use cases, being able to drive a different type of experience for customers based on business needs. So thinking of all the different virtual app and desktop offerings, the next thing we want to really talk about is what Citrix capabilities can leverage Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session workloads provided by Microsoft WVD. You have Workspace Premium Plus, the end-to-end offering that kind of provides the capabilities of virtual app and desktop service, as well as networking and analytics to drive hybrid cloud management across the overall user experience. going into the virtual app and desktop service, the platform I mentioned before, being able to manage virtual app and desktop workloads in a hybrid fashion across your enterprise to drive benefits such as the Windows extended security updates, as well as deliver net new use cases with the multi-session Windows 10. But one other exciting piece is the Citrix Virtual App Service. So while virtual applications, especially in a Citrix scenario, have always been primarily driven by a server-based experience, the virtual app service will be able to deliver multi-session Windows 10 as part of that overall platform. So thinking of the Citrix virtual application story, while it's always been remote RDSH-based hosts and multi-session app, but server-driven workloads, taking that same multi-session experience with the virtual app service can now apply those benefits to Windows 10 as well. And then the next piece is the managed desktop service. Like I mentioned before, the new service where Citrix will actually manage the infrastructure as a service for those virtual app and desktop workloads, those will also be eligible to deliver the overall WVD experience. So thinking of how does Citrix, expand and build upon the value of Microsoft with WVD? How can customers leverage Citrix and Microsoft together to drive greater levels of enterprise value? You have the advanced provisioning capabilities, taking images and hybridizing them using Citrix app layering and consolidating the overall management experience into a series of layers rather than the full sum of all the different independent parts that can go into an application. So thinking of, the app masking that Jeff mentioned before with FSLogix, being able to actually, consolidate and manage all those apps as independent layers so that you can kind of roll them all up into a different image, but then hybridize that image. Because as, organizations move from on-premise to the cloud, there's going to be that transitionary period. There's going to be workloads that need to stay on premises. Why not take that image and be able to kind of share it across two different platforms without having to double your overall image management workload? Being able to then scale out those images with machine creation services using a consistent provisioning and operational process, whether it be on premises or in the cloud, to scale out that multi-session Windows 10 in the same way you would grow server workloads or single-session workloads that would exist within your data center. Building upon FSLogix is also the concept of workspace environment management, being able to shift policies and printer mappings, registry keys out of group policy and maybe more into your team's control, especially as you're on the end user computing side and you might not have full access to GPOs, or you might want to streamline logon times by doing parallel processing at the logon process rather than a sequential profile load and an application of policies. But thinking of that operational and optimization of workloads is also auto-scale, being able to optimize costs, based on schedule and load of your overall cloud workloads, driving efficiencies in terms of that pay-as-you-go dollar per user per hour spend that you see with Azure workloads in the cloud. Citrix also extends Office, just like FSLogix can optimize the virtual desktop experience of things like OneDrive and Exchange. Citrix can also optimize Teams and Skype when it comes to virtual workload delivery. So taking that collaboration and that audio video support and being able to drive a high-end user experience, we build off of those Microsoft technologies and use our anywhere, anytime, any device methodology to drive that experience to end users, even if it's that desktop is centralized in an Azure cloud or centralized in someone's data center. Thinking of the Workspace Premium Plus offerings and driving greater levels of analytics, especially with Microsoft 365 and Azure Security Graph, you can add the performance metrics you get from a Citrix technology. What's the ICA around trip times? What are the user logon times, et cetera, and roll that in from a user experience core perspective as well as a security perspective. So getting metrics around failed logon attempts, people trying to take data from a drive redirection, or running into a scenario where someone's connecting from a different location that they're not always connecting from, and being able to pull those data points from Citrix as well as the data points from Azure Security Graph to drive a more proactive security approach. And while Azure AD is also a great IDP used by many customers, there's other IDPs out there. Being able to integrate the IDP of your choice to bring your own IDP into the overall solution for someone's workspace, to then kind of wrap that into your overall user experience and drive a consistent identity across your enterprise, not just for Windows workloads, but web applications and mobile. So Citrix and Microsoft, as we kind of really talk about all these features and kind of look at even just like the list of benefits and how the technologies augment one another, many times customers kind of start looking at the granularity, the control, and what's necessary to drive success within their enterprise, and having that combination of both technologies is what's required to kind of bring that user experience and deliver it in the most optimal way.
And so from the Microsoft point of view, we see a perfect time and strategy here to help deliver these different use cases to our customers, whether we are talking about highly secure environments that, oh wait, my talk track is different for our scenarios. Hold on a second. We have like our 4 scenarios. Just a second.
Yeah, I'm deleting those animations too, and this is from the deck. I have like the actual physical deck on like my other monitor, so that we can give like the global meet team like the correct one afterwards.
Awesome. The wrong location. Okay.
I can kind of I can kick it off if you want me to, and then you can just kind of add some of your flavor to it.
Yeah, it just took me a second to get my notes on our scenarios, and got it. All right, I'm ready.
So thinking of use cases,
So
especially those that, oh, sorry. I thought you were just waiting for me to kick it off. That's my bad.
I think he was going to start. I was like, I think he's going to start, but then I don't know if I should. Okay, I'll wait for you, and then I'll.
No, you can kick it off. That's fine.
Okay, thanks. So with Windows Virtual Desktop, we wanted to address these use case scenarios with our customers that are around temporary workforce, and this might have to do with users who are short-term employees, or maybe they're contractors that have partner access, as well as we wanted to be able to support those employees that have very specific heavy workload needs, like developers who need specific types of virtual machines. As the way we would think of that in Azure, whether they be compute intensive or videographic intensive. And many customers are scaling up and down, which is why the cloud makes so much sense. When they need to add users, they can do that quickly. When they need to decommission resources for those users, they can do that quickly. And so it makes a lot of sense in the cloud that we have this scale and this efficiency, and there's scenarios even with use case around security and regulation, and that's really a VDI and a shared session host scenario where we have financial services or healthcare, government who need secure and regulated resources. And so by locating them in the cloud close to the data center, we can keep all of our auditing, we keep all of our security in one place, and give us one place to manage that. And we get continuity of the cloud through our regions from Microsoft Azure. So we've got a number of use cases that help, that help match to our customers' needs in this scenario.
So even thinking of things like the temporary workforce, especially when it comes to Citrix, like especially with pay-as-you-go workloads and being able to kind of set up, from on-premises using something like app layering to build your initial image, have a Azure platform layer, and then drive using autoscale or like a machine catalog that's aggregated into the same delivery group or a separate one to burst into the cloud based on changes in that overall use case. Say, for example, end of the month, you have contractors that are part of your accounting department. They're going to be much more active when it comes to your virtual system. You need to burst into Azure from your on-premises data center to drive that overall use case. Or for example, especially when you think of like multi-session Windows 10, wanting to be able to deliver a client-based experience using less infrastructure. mergers and acquisitions, especially from a Citrix perspective, and using things like Azure AD and Citrix FAS to kind of separate to start bringing in a user's identity from a different organization and start kind of driving that consolidated user experience. Thinking of, especially with what like Jeff mentioned, being able to have a closer proximity to a net new set of end users and being able to deploy those workloads in a way that can be efficiently accessed. So as we think about all these use cases, and especially for a basic standard, I want to get started with WVD and Citrix, and I want to start leveraging Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session within my use cases. Thinking of the conceptual architecture, it starts with the end user. It starts with workspace apps set up either on their thin client, their laptop, mobile device, tablet, etc., using that fixed client or HTML5 driven approach. They would access the environment using Citrix Cloud and Citrix Workspace. They would then be presented their applications, their desktops that are delivered through on-prem or Azure with multi-session, single session, however it needs to be configured for that use case. You would then be managing those workloads and that experience using the virtual application and virtual app and desktop service within Citrix Cloud. And then within your Azure subscription, so this would be in a Citrix Cloud use case where you have the services itself and you're using the platform rather than using the managed desktop service where we would own the Azure subscription. You would have your Azure subscription established. You'd have had the conversations with your team regarding governance, virtual networks, and ownership and management of that system. You deploy cloud connectors to establish a resource location for your Citrix Cloud to then manage that location within Azure. This could be one location, it could be multiple. And then you would be able to manage this consistently between your on-premises data center, because that would just be another set of cloud connectors, as well as your Azure region. You would then work and then deploy that multi-session VM and then use machine creation services to then scale out that virtual deployment to then meet the workloads that are necessary for your use case. So again, thinking of this process, especially when it comes to getting started, starting with that Azure subscription, establishing your Citrix Cloud account. One of the first things you want to do as a prerequisite is set up Active Directory connectivity. Being able to deploy your virtual network, set up your cloud connectors as domain joined machines, so you have the ability to start provisioning resources based on the identity of your organization. From there, using the Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session image from the Azure Marketplace, you can start building your baseline image. Citrix, from a Citrix perspective, to integrate that new use case into the overall virtual app and desktop service, it starts with the multi-session VDA. So Citrix, we have changed the terminology of our VDA from client OS and server OS to single session and multi-session. So again, going back to the Citrix services eligible for WVD, the virtual app service being more of that multi-session experience. Typically, while that was driven from a server OS VDA, we've transitioned that overall user experience to what is a workload that I can host multiple users on, whether it be a server OS, client OS, that is going to be driven from that same multi-session VDA. And then once you have that image deployed and you're connected, you're registering, you've done your optimizations, having that host connection set up, and we'll get into just some of these considerations later so that your Citrix Cloud environment can then start provisioning and building machines using Citrix MCS. And then from there, you can begin to publish apps and desktop resources to your end users. So thinking of that starting point and getting to where you want to be when it comes to deploying this net new workload, this Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session experience that's driven by WVD, it's not one of the only benefits, especially when you think of some of the areas that we highlighted previously about driving more business value with Citrix and Microsoft together. There are a lot of organizations that are going to be moving in this direction, but there might be some tech debt from old legacy operating systems like Windows 7 or 2008 R2.
And with these legacy operating systems, our path for Microsoft to the cloud is to help with helping our customers, give them more runway. It's not easy to move workloads. There has to be planned migrations, and so what we have done is given a number of options for organizations to be able to meet what they immediately need to get done. The first option is that we can take those 2008 workloads and we can migrate them into Azure. And once they're in Azure, they will receive free extended security updates running in Azure, which gives a customer another 3 years to go ahead and think about the modernization of the workload on that application, or to think about the modernization to another server operating system. And so just like with Windows Server, you have this opportunity to migrate to a modern operating system or to migrate into Azure. When it comes to on-premises, we do have extended security updates that can help customers who need to stay on-premises. But the idea here is to move these workloads to Azure and enjoy the savings of that free security updates, and that can be help with momentum on cloud adoption, right? And so with Windows 7, we also have extended security updates, 3 extended security update years for those users. And with the WVD, we are compatible with Windows 7. It's not multi-user, it's one instance for Windows 7, but if a customer right now has Windows 7 VDI infrastructure, we can replicate that, we can migrate that into Azure, and then a customer can use Windows 7 in Azure Cloud with the WVD service.
So for those customers listening, especially if there's a use case that's hard to move, you have like a legacy, you have an application that's made for a legacy OS. It's maybe there's the knowledge capital is no longer with the organization, that the change windows are complicated. There are ways, especially using Citrix Cloud and the virtual app and desktop service, to help streamline that transition, especially while you're in that hybrid state and you're looking to use the benefits of extended security updates provided by Microsoft. So again, starting with that process of Citrix Cloud and setting up that account and building those resource locations, once you've established that VPN or express route connectivity between your on-premises data center and your existing Azure, and you've set up those cloud connectors, you now have a scenario where you can then start to manage both locations, your on-premises data center and your Azure cloud, from one centralized point of management with Citrix Cloud. Thinking of existing Citrix workloads you might have today, like if you're doing like 7.6 LTSR, like 7.15 LTSR in the standard do-it-yourself perpetual Citrix the standard do-it-yourself customer managed architecture of Citrix virtual apps and desktops. Those VDAs that you have on premises, they register just like they do to your delivery controllers to the cloud connectors. So once you've set up and you've built those VDAs and you've set up those cloud connectors, you can then start re-registering workloads on premises to those connectors to then manage them centrally within Citrix Cloud. And then once you've set up and you've started utilizing the cloud service, getting workloads registered, you can actually deploy NetScaler within Azure. So even if Storefront exists on-prem, you could use something known as optimal gateway routing, so that where I, as an end user, you're in that state of transition, I'm hitting my existing Storefront. It's transparent to me that I don't know how those apps are managed. You can be managing them with your existing Citrix environment, your legacy deployment, and Citrix Cloud simultaneously. And then I, as an end user, once you've added the 7.15 VDA to 2008 say if you're still coming from 6.5, and then you've migrated those workloads into Azure and provisioned them out using machine creation services, I can click that on-premises storefront, and using optimal gateway routing, I can then connect to that OS that's using the Microsoft extended security updates to then be able to access that app seamlessly through Citrix Workspace app. Now, there are always considerations with regards to application data. Not every application will be able to behave or operate in that separated fashion, where the backend may still be existing in your data center and you've shifted the front end to Azure. So as you go through this process, you definitely want to plan for that accordingly. And that actually gets into the next segment of this webinar when it comes to, I want to get started. I understand the high-level process. I have a better understanding of what is WVD, what are some of the components regarding Windows 10 Enterprise, multi-session, FSLogix, etc. And I'm ready to get started. I have an Azure project. What are some of the things I need to think about? So as we start talking through these other components, a lot of these considerations fall into the management of your Azure subscription. So the scope of this conversation really sits with the virtual app and desktop service within Citrix Cloud. And Jeff and I actually, in a previous webinar back in September, we dove into of last year, we dove into the operations and management and just really in detail running with the Citrix and Microsoft leading practices in Azure subscription. A lot of the principles still apply, and we're going to be going through at a higher level within this webinar, but definitely recommend checking that out when you have the time. It is available on YouTube. So at the start of really any Azure planning experience, you've gone through, you've done your proofs of concepts, you've had the conversations as an organization, you understand your use cases, and you've gone through some of that assessment and design process. Shifting your Citrix workloads to Azure, understanding the governance and management of those resources is critical to overall success. So knowing that what at a cloud platform level, what your organization's goals are from a subscription setup, from Azure policy, what instances and are we going to allow or disallow, what type of audit policies are we going to have, what are the standards we're going to follow. You always want to make sure that your Citrix requirements are expressed during that conversation. So like Citrix, for example, especially when we get into the host connection and provisioning of Azure resources with machine creation services, we use that subscription as the entity to connect into Azure. So knowing if that subscription is shared with the organization across multiple teams within the organization, or if you're isolating them by business unit or IT department, having a conversation regarding that setup and your current policies, and also cross-referencing the growth that you expect to have within your Citrix deployment, especially looking at now Windows 10 multi-session, being able to scale out VDI in the cloud in a way that is much more cost efficient, and being able to provide a user that client OS experience versus server OS. You might have growth that might have been unexpected, and that's managed via the subscription in terms of scale, subscription limits, being able to use the Azure APIs in a way where you want to power up a large amount of machines for a DR exercise. So you may need one subscription dedicated to Citrix. You might need multiple if you're looking at larger scale with thousands of machines. Or if you have a smaller use case, you may have a set of resource groups within a shared subscription across multiple teams where you're applying the right RBAC rules. So understanding the governance of your organization, as well as some of the parameters within Azure, especially around availability, SLAs, like using availability sets or availability zones for your core infrastructure like cloud connectors, is definitely critical to overall success.
And in Microsoft, we've done an update to our cloud adoption framework that includes our newest tools around Azure blueprints to help with scenarios on governance. We can define them by policy. So this allows you to manage multiple subscriptions in the same fashion and have common parameters defined for those subscriptions around security policies, around configurations for encryption, around roles and specific users, as well as allows you to see what resources are allocated together. And so our new cloud adoption framework is an update that we wanted to talk about here because it's a holistic process that allows you to build out governance across your resources, as well as helps, we've documented our best practices for cloud architects and IT professionals and business decision makers so that they can successfully achieve getting that cloud adoption deployed and getting resources into the cloud.
So starting from the governance perspective, and you've had those conversations and you know more about the policies, you started using and setting up that cloud adoption framework from a Microsoft perspective. The next piece is virtual networking, having those conversations with your team on the network security side regarding subnetting, et cetera, and building that virtual network for your Citrix deployment. Thinking of Azure's parameters around network security groups, user-defined routes, a lot of that is done within the subnet level. So setting up your Citrix subnets, let's say, for example, by use case, is going to drive a lot more flexibility in the long term when it comes to being able to adapt to changes in network security or adapt to different parameters around isolation if you need to then have a use case that has higher network security parameters than others. Another piece as well is the on-site to Azure connectivity, especially if you are in a hybrid cloud scenario like we mentioned with extended security updates or adding a net new use case that's cloud driven because it's temporary or seasonal or cloud-based DR. What we typically see within the enterprise space is using ExpressRoute for those large-scale deployments because it's a dedicated private connection, lower latencies. But site-to-site VPNs are also common, especially for customers that are just getting started or have a smaller use case. But regardless of the connectivity method you use, from a Citrix perspective, it's critical to understand that that's typically going to be a shared resource. So making sure it's monitored from a utilization perspective, making sure it's highly available, et cetera. Because that's where potentially, ICA traffic might be flowing between your two locations of on-premises and Azure. So having those conversations as an organization where what's our expected ICA bandwidth versus application replication versus domain traffic, and understanding those other contenders for overall utilization and planning for those contingencies when it comes to scaling out that network connectivity between your on-premises data center and Azure becomes critical. So thinking of your governance and your networking, and now you're ready to start building machines. So the next thing we want to start thinking about is compute. And what we just did within Citrix is we just completed another round of scalability testing using some of the latest operating systems like Server 2019 and Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. So while the subscription governance networking really applies to virtual app and desktop service and managing your own Azure subscription, some of the key takeaways here would also apply to managed desktop as you choose the right instances and instance types for your use case within that managed service.
This is a good breakdown of the types of compute services we have in Azure. These different VM series will match the different workloads that users have, and one of the things to note about our VM series is that we go back on our Azure infrastructure to version 1. So we have a number of different types of versions of virtual machines leading up to the latest V3 versions that were released across these different families and instance sizes, as well as you'll see where some of them, like with the GPU that's listed here, the GPU architected VMs, they have a specific letter, so NC, NV. Those designations help us understand from the VM SKU that NC is going to be our compute optimized VM. So that VM is going to have a GPU in it that's going to be used for data sciences, life sciences to process and compute data. The NV series is for video, right? And we even have an ND series, and then the D series is for deep learning. It's neural nets that uses the Tesla P40 GPU. So we've got a lot of different options for compute and to be able to meet specific workload needs in Azure. So with context to specifically our Citrix series VMs, we see a lot in the D and the F series that's deployed. And maybe we can take a look at, what are some of the considerations there, Kevin?
Yeah, and exactly like Jeff mentioned, the D and F series are the most common that we see within the Citrix deployment, and especially with the different Azure families. Think of that dollar per user per hour that you're really kind of investing in that piece of infrastructure within Azure. If you're going to storage optimize, you're investing some of that dollar per unit of performance. More of that's going to storage, or more of that's going to a GPU, for example. And within Citrix, a lot of workloads tend to be either general purpose or more compute driven. So looking at the D series instances of general purpose, where you have for every virtual core about 4 gigs of memory. And then for the F series, you have higher performing compute, but every virtual core is then given 2 gigs of memory. So from a scalability perspective, especially looking at the latest operating systems using the latest Citrix tools, we focused on those two instances and what's going to drive the most optimal dollar per user per hour performance. So in our testing, we used the virtual app and desktop service, analyzed 2016, 2019, and WVD using the task and knowledge worker profiles within FSLogix. We started with the default Windows settings with Windows Defender and Office 2016 to kind of really get an unoptimized common Office use case where because not every customer has gone through optimizations, and we want to see what was the standard baseline. So thinking of the initial comparison between F series and D series, we end up seeing that as you start to kind of scale out your workloads, you start driving greater cost efficiencies in terms of dollar per user per hour, which is the metric we typically use for efficiency of, I can get this many number of users in this machine, and if I'm paying, if I'm using a pay-as-you-go instance, this is going to drive a greater cost efficiency for my organization. we saw that F series and D series were somewhat in alignment, but the one thing that we saw from this test that differed from some of the other tests is that F series was really starting to get bottlenecked, or like the overall VSI max score was starting to be impacted by memory bottlenecks rather than compute bottlenecks. So while we had like higher levels of CPU performance, as we start getting into a lot more browser use cases or workflows, we're starting to see the amount of memory used per user start to increase. So we actually saw the bottlenecks were typically being CPU in the F series is actually memory. And kind of taking some of those lessons learned and then also going across and comparing another D series instance, same instance size across OS, we end up getting a better understanding of OS-based scalability, starting with Server 2016 being the most scalable, working to 2019 and working to Windows 10. Now, especially when you think of like multi-session Windows 10 and driving cost efficiencies, you're taking something that used to be a single user per OS, a single user per unit of compute, and then you're making it multi-user. You're not virtualizing the OS multiple times to drive that client experience. So while in some of our initial testing, especially since this is unoptimized, client OSs tend to be much more visually driven. You have the store-based applications, and there are some differences in scalability. There are still a lot of benefits, especially when it comes to driving cost efficiencies, because you're taking something that was always one-to-one and you're creating it one-to-many. So thinking of and pairing that with the benefits of reducing application packaging burden. So now you can have one package that can be deployed for a single session Windows 10 or Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session. Even though we saw some differences in scalability and thinking of going from 2016 to 2019 to Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session, there is still a lot of value to be given in terms of some of the capabilities. And this is just the beginning, especially as we just enter the first phase of driving this net new use case using Windows OS. Another big piece that we also kind of tested, especially with Citrix Virtual App and Desktop 1903, was MCSIO, being able to offload some of the storage utilization, just like you see on premises with provisioning services and machine creation services, being able to drive some of that storage performance in Azure to memory. So like going back to what we mentioned before, where we saw better cost efficiencies and similarities between the F series and D series, but the D series having more memory to actually really take advantage of this feature, we were able to actually compare premium storage and standard storage using this I/O cache. And especially as you get to larger instances, you start to see storage bottlenecks with standard storage in terms of how much I/O can be driven on a per user basis. And that actually impacted the overall scalability of the instances compared to premium storage. But using the MCSIO, we were able to kind of verify that, based on those login BSI profiles, you can actually get a similar performance compared to premium storage in terms of user scale and minimizing storage bottlenecks by offloading some of those IOPS into the memory of the actual instance. So thinking of, what you see from a dollar per user per hour benefit of, scaling out machines and similarities between F and D series, but driving, having memory bottlenecks in F series versus D series, as well as the OS, it's also, comes to really think of, especially as you're planning compute, the different types of cost models when it comes to Azure instance pricing, pay-as-you-go versus reserved. And while there's a lot of lines on this table and it's a little bit overbearing, one of the key takeaways from this is that reserved instances, especially if you have a temporary use case and you're using hybrid use benefit, sometimes the optimal usage of that instance might be better if you just reserve it. So, they're thinking of like the decision making, the complexities, things that need to be considered. It's always recommended to go in and if you're just getting started, start with pay as you go, determine the optimal instance size for your organization, and then reserve once you know the size that's applicable to you. So all like F series and D series getting into like 8 virtual cores or more is fairly common for a lot of Citrix customers to get started. Optimizing that overall cost is something that you want to go in with some data. And that's kind of where Citrix Autoscale can help as well, especially when it comes to blending reserved instances. It's something that you need to do a year or 3 years of capacity upfront versus having like the dynamic pay as I use it usage of compute can help you manage that. So for example, having a schedule where if I've reserved 50% of my capacity because I know based on the required uptimes, it makes more sense to reserve that. But I want to burst in a way where I'm going to then optimally use my pay-as-you-go instances. You can create schedule and load-based policies to drive that cost efficiency. And it's all built into the virtual app and desktop service and something that can be taken advantage of with a click of a button. And then kind of building on some of these concepts, especially when it comes to profile management and resource utilization, you have Citrix Workspace Environment Management. So FS Logic's driving some of the capabilities with caching of Outlook, of app masking, et cetera. Workspace Environment Manager can build upon that with resource management, being able to optimize RAM and CPU and I/O of that actual workload, as well as enhance some of the personalization requirements that really go out of a profile, like my printer mapping, maybe registry keys that are going to configure an application to better adapt to like my overall workflow, or shortcut placement, et cetera, logon scripts. That can also be driven by workspace environment management in a way that if you have some of those complex org structures where you might not have access to GPOs, et cetera, you can control some of that within your Citrix environment. This also pairs, application security, being able to take like the app masking feature of FS Logix and then build in a easier to use and easier to administer way app blocker policies for software restriction, for security enforcement and audit, et cetera, all from the same platform. Then another piece is Transformer, similar to Citrix Desktop Lock, taking the concept of a older physical appliance, throwing an agent, and then having that be able to boot up from a multi-session Windows 10 desktop within Azure. This is also something that is a cloud service as well with Citrix Cloud and operates with the same mechanisms as the virtual app and desktop service. So once you've set up and you've built a resource location on premises within Azure, you can deploy the workspace environment management agent to your virtual app or desktop workload, and then start being able to drive these feature capabilities and these enhancements for your overall use case. So kind of just wrapping up, especially when it comes to just some of the latest scalability guidance we've seen from our latest testing, is if you need to get started, you don't have that data, you have all of these instance types that are available to you, and you just want to start getting a proof of concept, start with D-Series, especially for general purpose use cases. If you know that your use case is more CPU bound and the memory utilization is low, F-Series is a good place to start. But if you don't have that data yet, D-Series is a good place to start, fresh. Premium storage, while it's something that is great for high I/O and business critical instances, you can always consider standard storage with the MCSIO process if cost control is critical. One key thing to know outside of performance, especially when it comes to Azure, is that premium storage also does come with a single VM SLA. So thinking of that end user who has my individual desktop, you're not splitting someone's individual desktop or one set of desktops across two availability zones, for example. The SLA of that single VM is critical because I, as an end user, my session is going to exist in that single VM. So regardless of performance, if you do have business critical workloads, you do want to start with premium storage. So, but the biggest takeaway here is adjust as needed, plan before you reserve, and the great thing about Citrix on Azure is there's a lot of flexibility because you're getting to use a platform that's very scalable, very elastic, very controllable, and then use tools like AutoScale and WEM to optimize your overall resource utilization and cost.
So we know, we've thrown a lot at you, and we really wanted to drive home the message that with Windows Virtual Desktop, it's a platform. It's not just multi-users Windows 10. We have a suite of technology that is incorporated into the cloud to help deliver the best experience to customers and to our partners.
And especially when it comes to integrating and leveraging Citrix and Microsoft, using those those capabilities between our two services, between driving hybrid multi-cloud, being able to extend and leverage the extended security support. Using these capabilities, especially between our two organizations, can help you achieve greater levels of business value. So knowing what those capabilities are and using them to your advantage, especially when you get into that planning process. And having that strong foundation, and with that strong foundation, it really being key to the overall success. So those are some of the key takeaways we want to emphasize from today's webinar, and especially as we kind of transition into the Q&A portion. How can Citrix help? How can Citrix help you go on this Citrix and Azure journey? We have our customer success services that are associated with our virtual app and desktop service platform. We have consulting services that can assist with assessment and design, and education services that you can use to kind of learn more about Citrix on Azure. And especially when it comes to like the TIPS program and continuing to drive beyond just this level of enablement, considering education to kind of get into more in depth and shifting from what is this Citrix on Azure journey with WVD into more how would I do this and how would I operate it.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much to both Kevin and Jeff. Before moving into the Q&A, I want to remind everyone to take advantage of the 10% education discount. And for those of you that just can't get enough tips, make sure that you subscribe to the series on our registration page. And then finally, I also want to introduce a new monthly series that we launched earlier this year. It's called the ACE Meetup, or the Ask the Cloud Experts, because you guys know we love our acronyms around here. And basically, we start off each month with a quick presentation just so you guys can stay up to date on the latest cloud features. And similar, we add a little bit of tips and tricks. It's just a shorter presentation. And then we open it up for a live cloud Q&A with a new panel of experts every month. So we bring in experts from all over the organization, and we can answer any and all of your cloud questions. So join us for the next meetup. It's going to be on October 30th at 10 a.m. Eastern. So be sure to check that out. And now, let's dive on into the questions.
Thank you, Michelle. And before we actually get started with the Q&A, Jeff and I also have an additional guest to help us with the live Q&A portion. Lily Shivalot it's one of our solution architects on our Citrix Alliances team, specifically focused on Microsoft. But to kick things off for the live Q&A, there's a handful of questions actually about licensing for WVD and some of the parameters there. Jeff, would you mind maybe covering that topic so we can kind of answer a few of those questions all at once?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kevin. So we think about the eligibility for the Windows Virtual Desktop Service. It's based on the licensing that a customer would have. So we think about Microsoft 365, it's the E3 and E5, or A3, A5 when it comes to those types of organizations, or the Microsoft 365 F1 and business licensing. And then we have the Windows 10 Enterprise and Educator and VDI licensing. So really the use, entitlement for WVD comes from the licensing type that user has. So that also includes, if we look at like FSLogix, what we talked about, the same licenses also are included for those users. So they get the WVD service as well as the FSLogix portion of the service. Now, when we look at our users who are going to be using the WVD service with a server, then we're going to be looking at CAL. So if a CAL or SAL is provided for that user, they'll have access to FSLogix and the WVD service. So when we deliver the WVD service, we can use the Windows 7 operating system to get those extended updates that we talked about. So that is a one-to-one user model. It's not multi-session. When we look at Windows 10, we can deliver that in a single user session or in a multi-user session. So the difference there as far as for our workload is just the difference between a shared hosted desktop or either a single user. If the app is specifically, an application is specifically designed to only work with a single user session, then that's where you have need for having a single Windows 10 instance VM. But multi-session is really just like a shared hosted desktop service. So that's how the sessions are handled. So you get access to use Windows Server as well, but you're going to need a CAL when you use Windows Server. The CAL licensing is not included. So what I mean by CAL license is if you have the Office 365 subscription, the M365 or the Windows 10 Enterprise, and you're going to use a server operating system, those users need to also have a CAL. So really, your Office 365 licensing should cover you if you're using Windows 7 or using Windows 10 single or multi-edition. And then on server, you're going to need to include the CAL licensing for those users connecting to the server. So that's kind of an overview of how we approach the licensing for the service.
And to build off of that too, Jeff, I also want to kind of clarify on some of like the Citrix licensing considerations. So from like a perpetual, like I own Citrix XenApp, XenDesktop, Platinum, etc., the perpetual version of the product that isn't the Citrix Cloud subscription service, you can leverage Azure workloads, but they are with the traditional server-based computing. You know, so I have a 2016 VM, and I'm doing a hosted shared desktop as well as published apps, or a single session VDI, for example, like Windows 10 or Windows 7 on Azure using like a 7.15 VDA. But when it comes to like the Windows Virtual Desktop and the entitlement for Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session, that does require the Citrix Cloud licensing. So that being Workspace Premium Plus, which includes virtual app and desktop capabilities, as well as intelligent workspace, analytics, etc. Then you have the virtual app and desktop service, which is strictly using the Citrix control plane to manage your virtual app and desktop resources. And then you also have the virtual app service, being able to deliver multi-session use cases, whether it be multi-session Win 10 or multi-session from a 2016 or 2019 machine. One key differentiator here is virtual desktop service. So if you have strictly Citrix virtual desktop service, you have you're using Citrix Cloud to act as your platform for management of your Azure or on-premises workloads in like a hybrid cloud scenario. Virtual desktop is really meant to now be that single session experience. I'm delivering a single session Windows 7 or a single session Windows 10 from Azure or on-premises, for example. So some things to keep in mind from a Citrix perspective, especially when it comes to licensing. And Jeff, thank you very much for clarifying on your side as well. And kind of moving through to some of the next questions, Loe, I think this would be a great one for you to work with, to help with. Does the Citrix Managed Desktop service include compute instance charges on an Azure platform, or the charges in addition to the Citrix Managed Desktop licensing?
Thank you, Kevin. So let me tackle a little bit of a few additional questions that also came through CND. Starting with your question. The Citrix Managed Desktop does have a licensing cost, and there's going to be another line item, which is the compute. You get this whole bill from Citrix as opposed to two separate things. Like you wouldn't get that bill from Azure. You get the whole bill from Citrix, the license, and the compute. Hopefully that clarifies it. Another question I think I saw around CMD was if autoscale is included. Autoscale is included with Citrix Managed Desktop, as well as Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktop for MCS. I'd like to also highlight one additional point in regards to licensing as well. I don't know if it was clearly mentioned in the presentation. Part of the entitlement that Jeff talked about and how you can use it with Citrix, the key thing here is that you get the VM price in Azure at a base rate, or what's referred to as a base rate. The easy way of looking at it, I'm going to pay the Windows rate for the VM or a Linux rate. So when you use WVD or when you're using WVD through Citrix, you get that advantage where you're not paying the price of the Windows VM, you're paying the price of quote-unquote Linux VM. It's not Linux, it's base VM, but for ease, I'm using the word Linux when you're looking at the prices on Azure. That's from a compute perspective.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to PVS versus MCS. While PVS is the provisioning mechanism for on-premises machine creation services, I know there's a few questions out there. Is PVS supported within Azure, etc. Machine creation services is the primary provisioning mechanism. And while using solutions like Citrix app layering and having like a different platform layer, say for example of your on-premises hypervisor with images managed by provisioning services, you can have a new platform layer that is Azure meant for machine creation services. So instead of doubling up your image count based on hypervisor and like provisioning technology, app layering is a great way to hybridize your image and then having like say a resource location on premises, a resource location in Azure. So then you can then present to the end user cloud-based workloads with like WVD, published apps, et cetera, or some of your on-prem applications or desktops that really rely on on-premises data, which really is one of the key limiters of like what should go to the cloud and when. So getting into like what Loe mentioned as well, one of the great capabilities of machine creation services within Citrix is the ability to kind of trigger within the provisioning scheme of the VMs, whether or not it's like bring your own license, like with something like WVD, or if you're using the pay-as-you-go, like built-in Windows license as part of, say, like a server instance, for example. That is all configurable and capable via Citrix provisioning and kind of builds off of some of the licensing considerations as well. And there's a lot of great questions, too, about reserved instances versus, pay-as-you-go, like when is a great threshold to consider. And maybe before we kind of get into that, especially when it talks about autoscale, Jeff, would you want to maybe walk through a little bit on like what is the reserved instance model, like how does it work in a little bit more of a technical detail? And then Loe and I can build off of that from a Citrix perspective.
Sure. So within the compute resources that Loe was talking about earlier, we have a charge that would be like for the Windows licensing part of the compute, and then a charge for the actual infrastructure cost. And so with reserved instances, you can pre-purchase the compute portion of that cost. And so if we look at the overall amount of time that a workload is going to run in the Azure cloud, we try to look at the baseline requirements to purchase our reserved instances, and then we'll go with purchasing pay-as-you-go or a la carte for the time that we're going to be above that baseline. And that way we can really capture all the cost savings for all of the workload that we're going to run during peak hours for the entire year, as well as get meet any kind of demand that we have for mergers or acquisitions or growth within our user base.
Excellent. And then thinking of like reserve versus pay-as-you-go, especially when it comes to like use cases, for example. And there was a couple questions around thresholds, like when does it make sense? A lot of times it's a math problem, going through and better understanding, okay, what's your daily uptime of this machine? Like when are users logging in? When are users logging off? How quickly can you drain the machine of sessions, for example, to shut down that workload to take advantage of the benefit of pay-as-you-go where, if it's off, you're not paying for the compute, you're just paying for the storage. So thinking about that daily utilization is going to drive the pay-as-you-go versus the reserved conversation. But another piece as well that's often overlooked is ephemeral use cases. For example, if I have this 6-month capacity that I might need from a seasonal worker or some interns or contractors. So looking not just at like the daily uptime of an instance, but also the existence of that use case. Like how long does that user need compute within my Azure resource location? Those conversations can help you drive whether or not it makes sense to reserve or use pay-as-you-go for that use case. But thinking of like baseline capacity, especially when it comes to autoscale, you can set a default schedule that leverages that reserved capacity. So say, for example, I have 100 users that are going to be accessing this system, and you know what, I'm going to reserve enough instances where 10% of that demand is going to be met through reservations. And then the bursting or like the remaining, 90 users, I'm going to use pay-as-you-go because it's a little bit more cyclical, for example. So within autoscale, you could set a default policy that leaves 10% of your instances on at any given time. And then as users start to peak and you have changes in load, the load management policy that's associated with that autoscale schedule can then handle the powering on of machines based on that demand. So since reservations are kind of tied more to an instance family rather than specific VMs, it allows you to kind of utilize autoscale and flexibly leverage both the reserved and pay-as-you-go model in a way that's optimal for your business.
Well said. If I'm adding, or if I'm re-emphasizing one thing you mentioned, Kevin, it should not be always a question of autoscale versus reserved, because you could and probably you should use both concurrently. And again, to the question that was very specific, when is the cutoff or what is the kind of break even? That's a tough question. Again, I'm going to re-highlight, because we can simply say when you're about 50% of 12 hours a day, maybe switch there, but it's not that simple, because it's how many VMs are up, how many users are logged on. Maybe there's only 10 users for 12 hours, so the other machines are shut off. So it's not an easy cutoff line there, just kind of highlighting what Kevin mentioned. But
Perfect.
You could use them together. That's the key.
Exactly. And thinking of using things together as well, there's another great question, and we can maybe we can end on this one because I know we're running a little bit over, is access layer. Didn't talk much about the access layer, how this worked with this kind of environment. One of the great things about Citrix Cloud, and especially if you're in a scenario, for example, like you're migrating from an on-premises data center, getting into a hybrid cloud scenario, looking to potentially shift from like a 6.5 with 2008 R2, and moving some of workloads into Azure, say, for example, to use the extended security updates. One of the great things about Citrix Cloud and the virtual app and desktop service is the access can be hybridized. So, for example, if you have an existing storefront server that's on premises, maybe it's tightly integrated with a NetScaler, now known as Citrix ADC, deployed within your environment for maybe badging or like a tap and go solution, for example. And you're starting to look at moving workloads into the cloud or shifting your management of your virtual app and desktop infrastructure into the virtual app and desktop service. Those cloud connectors that you use to really bridge your on-premises data center and your Azure data center into Citrix Cloud, those actually also act as a proxy for things like registration for XML brokering within that location. So when you're creating VDAs, you're registering to the cloud connectors, or when you're aggregating into storefront, those cloud connectors are just another set of controllers pointing to your Citrix managed site within Citrix Cloud. And then from a NetScaler perspective, those also act as your STAs. So if you do have a lot of investment or like a complex authentication structure that has a lot of tie-ins to a ADC or a storefront that you have managed within your environment, you can still leverage and migrate workloads to the virtual app and desktop service or workspace service or any other cloud services we mentioned that support the multi-session Windows 10 use case, because that is it is hybridized and hybrid capable when it comes to the access tier.
There's another set of questions you might want to take, Kevin. PVS, I saw multiple ones, and app layering probably.
Yeah, so PVS, when it comes to managing PVS as well, especially if you're on premises, for example, and you're utilizing Citrix Cloud, with the latest versions of the current release of provisioning services, you can actually use the virtual desktop creation wizard, et cetera, using PVS to Citrix Cloud with the remote SDK. And then app layering, the way it really kind of factors into that, and especially I see a couple questions around using app layering with Azure or using app layering with PVS. App layering, it takes your overall image and breaks it into multiple parts. You have the OS, that's Windows 10, Server 2016, Server 2019. You have the platform, think of it as your hypervisor. So like Citrix Hypervisor on premises with MCS, or Citrix Hypervisor with PVS, or Nutanix AHV, Hyper-V, et cetera. And then you have like Azure, for example, as another platform that you can then shift and modify in a way where, since your image is not just like one monolithic combination of your OS platform and your apps, you can break it out into independent pieces. So for example, if you have a platform for Azure, a platform for on-premises, tied to your OS layer of 2016, and then all of the apps that are associated with it, instead of doubling up your images. So you have 10 images, they're all made with your on-premises hypervisor tools. You want to scrub those tools out and then bring them up into Azure. You're potentially doubling your image count. App layering, the way it's really helpful is because that platform can be managed independently. You just have a template for Azure, a template for on-premises, and then you're updating your OS once, you're updating your applications once, and then all of that work can then be shared and utilized in that hybrid scenario. So we see a lot of customers, especially as they're looking at OS migrations, getting off of Windows 7 or getting off of 2008 R2, also looking at layering because they're in a process where they're building their image from scratch. And then looking at layering now also then allows you to be prepared for that future motion to the cloud, because you can then take your desktop, your app servers, and then turn that into a cloud-based image just by switching out the platform layer. And I know we've kind of run out, gone a little bit over, and thank you everyone for that stayed on. But what we'll do is we're going to probably go through some of the key questions we didn't get a chance to review, and then we're going to provide a Q&A blog as a follow-up for this session. Everything was recorded and will be available for reference. And thank you all for attending the webinar today. It's greatly appreciated, and hope you took a lot out of it.